Hello, welcome to another edition of At Home with the Roosevelts. Today we're going to be speaking with author and director of the Roosevelt House in New York, Harold Holzer, who has a remarkable new book out about presidents versus the press, topical subject. And Harold, thank you for joining us.
Paul, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Now, this book covers such a wide spectrum from Washington to Trump. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover all of it. I'm going to focus mostly on the ones that have direct relations with FDR. But I think we need to start with the election of 1800, which you do a fantastic job of describing. And I think for people who think that the partisan press today is a new development, looking at what happened in 1800 really is the foundation for everything that's happened since.
Certainly the foundation for intense partisanship, contested elections, nail-biting elections, but also, as I think you're implying, it's the beginning of partisan press coverage of elections. Washington had been elected unanimously twice. Adams did not have that much difficulty in 1796, but by 1800 we're in the throes of deeply partisan press coverage. Both Jefferson and John Adams have their own newspapers carrying their messages to the world and carrying antagonisms about the opposition to the public. And it's brutal. It's brutal. And one of the things that they're contesting is the Sedition Act, which John Adams had signed during his one term as president, in which reporters who merely ridiculed the president, were subjected to prosecution in the federal courts. And at least 17 of them were convicted, fined, and in some cases imprisoned.
Including the grandson of Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin, yes. Benjamin Franklin Bache, who started an anti-Washington newspaper and brutally ridiculed Washington all the way back to Mount Vernon, was one of those who was prosecuted. The founders, the surviving founders and their progeny were then deeply split, and it was all coming out in the press.
One of the other things that the election of 1800 sort of set the standard for was the introduction of scandalous personal information, specifically about Thomas Jefferson. Talk a little bit about how that happened, what the reaction was then, and how it's impacted everything since.
It has indeed. And one of the parts of the culture that needs to be recalled for this story is that journalists who supported particular candidates were accustomed to being rewarded. And Thomas Jefferson had given a journalist who came to the Capitol to start an anti-Washington newspaper a job in the State Department to help him afford the transition to Philadelphia. So skip to 1800, and a Republican editor named James Callender had carried the message of Thomas Jefferson and the anti-Adams message to his readers as the editor of a Republican paper, and then asked Jefferson to make him postmaster of Richmond. Not a big ask, really, but for some reason Jefferson didn't like the way he made the request and decided to deny him. One of the most foolhardy decisions that Jefferson ever made, because the editor abruptly switched allegiance to the Federalist side, but published a pamphlet accusing Jefferson of siring children with the enslaved woman, the very young enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, his own wife's half-sister, his late wife's half-sister. So it planted the seeds for a scandal that has rocked Jefferson's reputation for 200 years, and it was all for not following a principle that Jefferson had practically introduced, paying off newspapermen who were in your corner.
So the issues of presidential press conflict date right literally to the founding of our nation. Although I loved your chapter on Andrew Jackson, just because he's such a fascinating character, we're going to jump ahead to Abraham Lincoln as a war president, because I think you see issues happening there regarding what powers the presidents have in terms of controlling the press that are repeated again and again later on. So Abraham Lincoln really became president because of his understanding of how newspapers worked and his ability to set a narrative.
Absolutely. And he came to prominence in the age of roiling partisan press. He befriended Republican editors. They supported him. Its editors gave him advice, were part of his campaign team, were amply rewarded with federal jobs once he was elected in 1860. But as you say, once the Civil War began, a crackdown began on border state pro-secession or anti-union newspapers. They were rounded up. They were imprisoned without civil trial. They were put in military prisons. Francis Scott Key's grandson, the editor of a Baltimore paper, was thrown into Fort McHenry, where the Star Spangled Banner had once waved through the night, inspiring Grandpa to write the national anthem. Now his grandson was on the inside looking out without trial. But this crackdown spread to northern cities, to Philadelphia, to Washington, D.C. I guess you could call it a northern city because it was the Union capital, and to New York and to Boston after the Battle of Bull Run, when the 100-day volunteers ran out of time and had to re-enlist, and some Democratic newspapers in the North advised the soldiers not to do so. There was an immediate crackdown. Newspapers were shut down. They were thrown out of the post office. Not the first or last time that the post office was involved in controversies about what the freedom of communication. And newspaper editors were arrested, dragged to Washington, put into Fort Lafayette in New York City. So it was a roundup the likes of which we've never seen before. So people who are worried about Donald Trump and his castigation of the press, I think, are correct that he continues to erode confidence in journalism. But his bark is a lot worse than the bite of Abraham Lincoln and John Adams, and for that matter, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and even Barack Obama.
So one of the things about the Lincoln era, even though the telegraph had been introduced, several decades earlier, he really was the first president to understand and to utilize the power of this new technology. Telegraph lines allowed for almost instantaneous transmission of news from the front lines back to the cities. But of course, the lines went through other stations all along the way, so you could listen in on what was being sent over the telegraph wires. And Lincoln took those telegraph wires and federalized them. You want to talk about that and what the impact that had on news distribution?
So you're right. Those are the two sides of the coin, precisely. One is he became a master of writing letters to public officials and newspapers that expressed his opinion on key issues, and then releasing them so that they were telegraphed around the country and appeared in every newspaper in the land. Unheard of instantaneous communication. But at the same time, after the Battle of Bull Run, the federal government took control of the telegraph wire, ostensibly to prevent the distribution of news that would give aid and comfort to the enemy. And the telegraph office was located in the Secretary of War's antechamber. Talk about inhibition. And for those of us who remember the movie Lincoln, we see Daniel Day-Lewis sitting in the telegraph office telling jokes, waiting for military news. But that was the office where journalists also had to go to transmit reports. And it was not exactly a friendly place for critical news. In fact, the operators would not transmit news that they deemed too critical. And they stopped doing so right after the Battle of Bull Run.
Right. Yes, that transition, I think, from the Lincoln as the great communicator to Lincoln as the great censor is something that's often left out as we rank him as one of our greatest presidents.
Right. His trick was he did both at the same time.
Exactly. We're going to jump ahead now to Franklin Roosevelt's distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, because there was perhaps no president in American history who was more colorful, more dynamic, more spontaneous, more engaging of the press. And the impact that Teddy Roosevelt's personality had on his presidency, I don't think can be understated. I mean, what do you think?
No, I absolutely agree. And he comes of age in an era when partisan journalism recedes a bit. from the culture. And, it's post-yellow journalism, really the outer edge of yellow journalism. It's the age of long-form journalism and also front page journalism. And Teddy is made for both. He befriends Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens and the others who could write exposés of Standard Oil or the meatpacking industry to provide ballast for his progressive reform initiatives legislatively. And then he creates a press room in the White House, and he ushers in a daily briefing for the press while he's being shaved. Imagine the scene. He's in the hallway outside of the Oval Office with his personal barber holding a straight-edged razor over his throat. And the journalists would gather and ask off-the-record questions, although TR would often put answers he liked back on the record. And eventually the journalists enjoyed asking the most provocative questions when the razor was in fact at the most delicate point on FDR's face, because they knew he would jump up and wave his arms. The journalists thought he was the master public relations man of all time. But they also said, like the famous statement that he expected to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral, he also expected to be on the front page every single day. The miracle was that he often was. And when he wasn't, he invented things that we now take as part of our culture. Not only invented them, but invented the words for them. Trial balloons, leaks, swamping, which is an inside journalist term. When someone else is about to release a story, you swamp them by issuing your own story and getting at least a part of the front page. He was an absolute master. And speaking of technology, by the time he's running for a third term in 1912, he's also experimenting with newsreels, silent newsreels. And a newsreel camera is accompanying him through much of the 1912 campaign.
The other thing about Teddy Roosevelt was he had very strict rules. And if a reporter violated one of those rules, they were put in purgatory. What did they call it?
Well, it was a purgatory. It's called the Ananias Club.
The Ananias Club, right?
Named after the biblical figure who had been struck dead for lying to St. Peter. The ones who were in his good graces were part of the Oyster Bay atmosphere. By the way, FDR joked more than once during his press conferences about the Ananias. So he would say, I hate to revive the Ananias Club, but my cousin did it and I can do it. So it was part of the lexicon of journalism, White House journalism for generations.
And if you got in the Ananias Club, you were cut off. You didn't get anything.
Sometimes you got back in, but it was not easy. Sometimes Roosevelt would decree that members of the Ananias Club could not get press releases that were just left in the pile.
Right.
So the colleagues would have to sneak the press releases to the condemned men. It was not easy.
I find the Wilson story particularly interesting. Here's this intellectual, very astute, brilliant man who just absolutely struggled to have a relationship with the press. And his term, he served 2 terms. The first term is radically different from the second term because of the war. Talk about how that relationship evolved and his deep frustrations with the press.
Well, he should have known better for sure, because he had his brother was a newspaper editor. His ancestors were editors back to the founding generation. So one side are ministers, the other side are newspaper men. And he was an editor of the Princetonian, so he got it. And he was a writer, a prolific writer and an historian. But he was also innately suspicious, maybe because he knew journalism so well. And he just did not have the personality for the evolving journalism that TR had founded. And journalists said being briefed at the White House by Wilson compared to TR was like going from a foundry to a monastery or something to that nature. Wilson just didn't like the press. Before he even became president, during the transition in Bermuda, he threatened to punch a reporter in the nose for taking a photograph of his daughter riding a bicycle, of all horrors. And he carried that animus and that suspicion into the White House. He did introduce, ironically, he introduced formal news conferences, which he held standing up, reading prepared questions, and keeping everything off the record, including an occasional diatribe against the press, filled with kind of ascetic comments about things he didn't want to talk about. But he was accessible, at least with these press conferences. But by the time of his second term and the onset of the war, he is keeping himself distant. And of course, there are health crises that keep him distant as well. I have to tell you about one, which of course I foolishly kept out of the book. In 1918, when he was in Paris, he had taken a big press contingent with him to cover the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, the end of World War One. But during the period, he then denied them access, especially when he caught the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu. And supposedly he caught a very bad case. There were reports or reminiscences by some that he was in a state of delirium at one point. But when I was writing the book and having to choose between great anecdotes, I thought nobody wants to read about a pandemic. It's just something in the century-old past. So I left it out.
Well, now he also, like Lincoln, cracked down on newspaper editors. There were arrests, there were shutdowns of newspapers, confiscation of presses. He really felt that this was un-American for the newspapers to be criticizing his government, particularly once the war started. And it set a terrible precedent.
It did. In fact, the Espionage Act of 1918, I think it's still technically on the books. President Obama used it during his presidency to wiretap a couple of reporters who he suspected of printing leaks. But yeah, Wilson cracked down, as would FDR. I know we'll get to him, so not to give the story away. And he not only inhibited the free flow of journalism overzealously, as it turned out, but then again, I give him some leeway because he's fighting a foreign enemy and does not want to have shipments of arms and takeoff times of airplanes published in the press. But what Wilson also did that's rather remarkable is that he created the first official government propaganda unit, the Committee for Public Information, and named a newspaper man to run it. And they had pervasive impact on the culture. Everything from press releases to magazines to the posters we now regard as art, the I Want You posters, recruiting posters. There was such pervasive, maybe even invasive indoctrination that there was even a unit of the CPI that specialized in giving 90-second speeches during the minute and a half that it took to change reels for silent movies in movie theaters throughout the country. I didn't even know that you took 90 seconds until I read this, but there were specialists who gave pep talks about the war effort during the intervals.
Now, I'm going to digress for a minute here as I set up some background. So Franklin Roosevelt served under President Wilson as his Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy was Joseph Daniels, both sort of a conservative, reserved men. And FDR was constantly pushing to be more open, to have more public access, to use the press more effectively. When he left the administration, the following year, he got polio and sort of went into the wilderness. And the press was very interested in his story. And then in 1928, he roars back into the political scene, despite the paralysis of his lower body, as governor of New York, at which point he starts doing these sort of radio broadcasts. In 32, he becomes elected president. And then he really completely changes the relationship between the federal government and the American public, particularly in the way he communicated. So there's two big topics here. One, the way you describe his early press conferences is absolutely fantastic. But then, of course, there's the fireside chat. So let's start with the fireside chat, particularly his first official fireside chat in March.
Well, here is a president who believed in granting access most of the time, but also going around the press ingeniously, establishing a precedent by using the newest technology. And of course, that was radio. And he had the technical equipment for it. He had a beautiful voice. He modulated it. And although that first fireside chat, I think, was a little high pitched, and a little breathless. I think he improved. It was a revelation. Here he is asking people to follow with him as he helped them through the banking crisis. I want to talk to you about banking. And he put himself immediately on the side of the audience as someone who had to learn some of the intricacies aside from saving money and drawing checks. It's just Professor Roosevelt, as he liked to call himself, at his very best. And Paul, as we know, there were only 28 fireside chats in 12 years. But if you talk to people or talked to people who lived through that period, as I did to my parents who worshiped FDR, they believed he was on the radio every night or every week. It was like Jack Benny or Burns and Allen. And of course, he was on with other speeches, eventually with State of the Union messages. But the power of those intimate addresses, which seemed unrehearsed, but of course were very carefully prepared and written and edited, was monumental. I love to tell one story about Saul Bellow, who was in Chicago as a member of the Federal Writers Project in a traffic jam on a hot August night during the Depression, happily listening to the start of a fireside chat in a taxi, but eventually becoming so overheated, he had to decide between the chat and getting out of this cab that was absolutely dead stuck in traffic. He decided to get out and walk down this boulevard thronged with cars. To his amazement, every car had its window open. And as he strolled more than a mile, he never missed a word of the fireside chat because every car radio was tuned to Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's just Bellow didn't like his accent because he had a Chicago, but he said even the patrician accent somehow worked.
You know, about that first radio fireside chat about the banking crisis, as the comedian Will Rogers famously said, FDR explained the banking crisis so well that even the bankers understood what had happened. One of the things that very few people don't know about Roosevelt was that he held 998 press conferences during his term. Now, he served longer than any other president, but that's still just an extraordinary number. And these weren't press conferences where he was standing behind a podium and they were seated and there's all this distance. They literally sat on the Oval Office desk and crowded into his room. And it was a give and take that was really, I mean, it harkened a little bit back to the Teddy Roosevelt, but it really was unique. And you do such a fabulous job in the book describing these scenes. Talk a little bit about how those press conferences evolved and how he would manipulate the reporters who all adored him.
They did adore him, even the ones who worked for publishers who did not adore him. And we have to remember, FDR never won majority editorial support in any of his 4 campaigns, which is remarkable, even during the war. So it was a fascinating scene. He would be seated at his desk, the wheelchair taken away. The usher would open up the outer door and then ring. The buzzer would ring and they would open the inner door and the reporters would flood in to the Oval Office where FDR sat, usually nervously to those who were really keen to his moods, usually playing with some of the knickknacks on his desk or putting a cigarette into one of his ivory cigarette holders and lighting up. He was kind of nervous before each one. And there would be bantering with the senior reporters around him, which is, and the amazing thing is that everything was transcribed, including the banter. Is that a new suit? How much was it? $10. Oh, as much as that. Or I see you need to have a seat as much as I need to have a seat. One press conference starts with someone making a contribution to a polio fund, which is remarkable that there was such open dialogue about that. And Roosevelt taking the check and saying, this means a lot. Thank you very much. And then they would settle down and it would officially begin. And it would be from 20 minutes to an hour of, I'm estimating, only the first one was recorded and then some later ones on radio. But the transcripts are fantastic. And Roosevelt keeps everything off the record, although if a reporter importunes him, he will ask his press secretary, Steve, let's get something out on that, and they would indeed put out a mimeograph press release. But in the beginning, he just is setting up rules. Um, don't ask silly questions. Uh, don't waste my time. Uh, and then in the second set of rules, we're locking the door because last time people ran out and filed stories prematurely and took advantage of being in the rear, and we can't have that. Just extraordinary. And the knowledge that this man had about the workings of the government, about foreign policy, about economics, about politics, uh, but every 2 times a week. And one day he would do it in the morning to give a lift to the afternoon papers when there were such a thing. And one day he would do the afternoon for the morning papers. He would say often, I'm going to get you out of here early so you can go play golf, almost with envy that they could do that. He would talk about his fishing, his conquests, and how he did on the boats when he was fishing. It was just extraordinary command. But like all presidents who hold frequent scrums with the press, he could also get irritated. Um, the same way that Donald Trump says that's a nasty question or a wise guy question, he was prone to say once in a while, "That's a really bad question. Go stand in the corner. Put on your dunce cap." So, it wasn't on TV, but it was rough stuff.
So my favorite press conference was the one that he did in December of 1941. To set the scene a little bit, England has been fighting the war since September 1st, 1939. The Americans have been isolationists. On December 7th, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And the doors open and the press comes in, and sitting there next to Franklin Roosevelt is Winston Churchill.
Right.
Talk about that, because that's such an amazing moment.
Well, they were accustomed to guests. Eleanor would sit in on some of the press conferences, especially at Hyde Park, where she would knit during the press conferences. By the way, she was having hundreds and hundreds of press conferences of her own for the women. There was Churchill, the White House visitor, there to observe this extraordinary American tradition that he was rather surprised about, and answering a couple of questions as well. At one press conference, he stood on a couch or stood on a chair to be seen, which is, I think, the only time that happened at a public event from the time that General Grant had to stand on a couch in the East Room to be seen on the day he was made Lieutenant General in 1864 with journalists in the room. I know, it's extraordinary. And there was one press conference where two of the sons, I think FDR Jr. and Elliot, came in and said, "Bye, Dad, we're off." And Roosevelt said, "Have a safe trip, boys." And I don't know where they were going, but it was informal, to say the least. It's probably not as intimidating as having Jared sitting in on the press conferences.
So the other thing about the unique relationship that FDR had with the press was his medical condition. And certainly, presidents have tried to withhold information about their medical state. Woodrow Wilson famously, after suffering a terrible stroke, his wife essentially ran the country. John F. Kennedy with his Addison's disease, and others. Many presidents have tried to maintain a secrecy around their health. But with Franklin Roosevelt, it was really a completely unique situation. He was already famous when he got polio. People knew that he had polio. His first public appearance, 1924, he's on crutches at the stage of the Democratic National Convention. He clearly, when he is seen in public, he has to be assisted, but he has created an illusion that he can walk. Even though he's completely paralyzed and has steel braces on his legs, he's sort of created an illusion that he is mildly lame, but essentially no one outside of his inner circle knew the extent of his paralysis. And the press went along with it. They never photographed him being carried in and out of cars or in the wheelchair. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary collaboration or conspiracy to prevent the American public from really finding out about his health.
And I looked for explanations among the reminiscences of a few of the photographers, and there's been excellent work on the photographs of Franklin Roosevelt. One study was written by someone who had polio and had a specific interest in the blackout on news. The most I could find were photographers saying he was just such a nice man, and we didn't want to hurt him, and he had a tough enough job, and he was trying to do the right thing. Uh, and what was uncanny about it is that there was some intentional deception by the Roosevelt camp. In 1932, when Herbert Hoover, by the way, who was having his medicine ball workouts on the White House lawn, was convinced that Roosevelt's health would defeat him, FDR organized a Liberty magazine inquiry about his health. And not only to say that he was vigorous without mentioning his paralysis, but also saying that he suffered, that there was no evidence of heart disease or blood pressure problems, which was an outright lie. And there's a letter at the FDR Library from one of the writers to FDR saying, well, we really got away with the Liberty magazine stories. So that part was conscious. But the photographer's conspiracy, friendly conspiracy, was extraordinary. When a photographer in the White House tried to get a picture of him in his wheelchair in the 1930s, there was always a photographer on hand to give him a knock to blur that picture and render it unusable. Now, at the beginning of the war, I think the press got tired of a lot of things, like Roosevelt's games in his press conferences, his barring them from some events just on a whim, and also the ban on photography. And that's when the gentleman's agreement morphed into policy. And Press Secretary Stephen Early banned photographs of Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and then banned informal photographs, requiring photographers to have a tripod and set up their photographs. So there was a much higher degree of protection. And as Robert Caro has written, at least one occasion when a photographer took a picture of the president struggling down the gangplank of the ship, only to have his film ripped from his camera. And when FDR was photographed from a great distance by Life magazine, being wheeled to visit, I think, Harry Hopkins at Walter Reed, Stephen Early, the press secretary, issued a ban on any photography, a photograph of the President of the United States while visiting an Army or naval base. So that sort of encompassed the wheelchair photographs.
Well, we have 140,000 photographs here in the library, only 4 of which show him in a wheelchair. I could talk about FDR for the rest of the day. We're running out of time. There's at least 2 other presidents I want to really briefly get your take on, because you did such a great job. After Roosevelt, the next big technological innovation was television. And there were 2 presidents, Kennedy and Reagan, who mastered the art of television. Talk a little bit about Kennedy, particularly his televised press conferences, and then the way Reagan used television for its visual power.
Well, Kennedy wasn't the first to do televised press conferences. Eisenhower gave the first televised press conference, but he was so sour about it, saying at the outset, well, we'll see how disruptive this is, that it really didn't work. Standing ponderously over a desk as if he was a general pondering maps. Kennedy used the same technicians who had so successfully set up his makeup and the backgrounds at the debates with, especially the first debate with Richard Nixon, that may have helped elect him, may have elected him, in fact. And the press conferences were staged not at the White House for Kennedy, but at the State Department. And in a raked theater-style auditorium with a blue backdrop, now de rigueur for all political figures, they built a podium with the seal of the president in front of it. That was the first. And of course, Kennedy then displayed his charm, his wit, his significant command, his willingness to take responsibility for mistakes, which is no longer a practice that many presidents will emulate. The reporters did not like it at first. They thought they were being taken for a ride. One reporter memorably wrote that it was like watching Kennedy making love in Carnegie Hall. But I think they got into it because suddenly people were recognizing the reporters on the street and saying, didn't you ask a question at the press conference? Anyway, in addition to reading 998 press conferences whose transcripts reside on your website, Paul, I also watched almost all of JFK's press conferences, and remained astonished at how adept he was, not only at handling major issues, but at calling on whenever the press conferences seemed to be kind of dragging. He called on a reporter whom FDR used to enjoy teasing a bit. She was one of the few women who attended FDR's press conferences, May Craig. And by the time Kennedy was president, she was older. She wore a distinctive and almost comical flower pot hat, and but she could always be relied on to ask a question in a kind of a doddering way, like one of the aunts in the play Harvey, or one of the one of the murderous aunts in the other play whose name I'm forgetting, but. Kennedy would always have a just saying very easy on me today, Ms. Craig, would get a laugh, and it just lightened up the press conferences. By the way, he prepared for these assiduously. He rehearsed in the morning. He rehearsed while he was getting dressed before the drive to the State Department. So of course, he revolutionized the presentations. But like FDR, using radio, he was using a new medium and one that he was terrific at, to communicate around the press. Reagan did the same thing, and he was maybe not as adept at press conferences, although it was extraordinary to me to read how much of the briefing book he just committed to memory, yep, using his training as an actor. And the deer in the headlight moments occurred every once in a while when he was befuddled. But what he mastered was the photo opportunity. The single message. He was, handsome, graceful, imposing man. He stayed on message every day. He managed to, not just celebrate Physical Fitness Month, but show that he was still adept at barbells at age 70. And my favorite thing that he did, and I think most of your viewers will remember this well, unlike President Trump, who never met a rope line he didn't like to participate in and answer questions and insult the occasional journalist, Reagan would walk from the White House to his helicopter, always cupping his hand over his ear to feign deafness, or looking at it, pointing to his watch, meaning he had no time. How did he get away with it? Well, he was doing what a silent screen actor would do. He was pantomiming his responses with adroitness. And so in both prepared remarks, delivery, being photogenic, and being graceful, and staying on message, which most presidents can't do. Although George W. Bush was pretty good at it too. His mentors his communications advisors gave him a message of the day, and he pretty much would not be diverted from it.
The legendary ABC journalist Sam Donaldson made a career out of shouting questions to President Reagan as he walked to the helicopter.
Right. Only a tenth of which he heard or admitted to hearing.
Well, we're running out of time. We're going to save Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump for our next conversation.
It's a deal.
Because those chapters are equally fascinating. I can tell you that I really enjoyed reading this book. Now, obviously, I spent many years working at a news museum, and so I'm familiar with some of these stories. But the research you did, the quality of the writing, and how relevant it is to what we're experiencing today, I just can't recommend this book enough. Harold, thank you for joining us.
Paul, thanks for having me, and thank you for those very kind words. I appreciate it.
And we'll see you on the next At Home with the Roosevelts. Thank you.